welcome to, I'm your host, Chantel Meyburgh, and I'm here again with the lovely Jessie Czebotar, who is no stranger to this channel anymore, that's for sure. Jessie with some incredible stories to tell, being trained, being in the system rather, being trained to be the Queen Mother of Darkness from a very, very young age. So today what we're going to be focusing on really is looking at the kids in the system, part of her cell group, and how, that actually affects them into adulthood in this day and age. I think it should be quite an interesting topic. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to bring Jessie up.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Jess. How you doing?
Doing well. Yes, a lot of exciting stuff always happening on my website and channel, and right now I'm in the middle of my first online workshop, the Open Our Eyes, Lord. And we had our first night last night, but that is going amazingly. And I encourage people to check out the kingdomlivingwithjessie.com, especially for April 12th. We have our first decode of the International Crest, where I'll start to teach people how to read the quadrant symbology for the crest.
Wow, that's amazing. We really are getting a lot of very valuable information from you regarding decoding the system, really. It's amazing just to see what's going on right in front of our eyes, right? That's what we always say, because they really are. It's a language of its own. They kind of connect with each other on, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, maybe today you can take us back to your childhood stuff. I'm just sitting here thinking, in the beginning, when I first started interviewing you, we spoke a lot about your childhood and what it was like in the system. And we haven't actually spoken about that for so long. So I'm actually looking forward to today. So, yeah, and I know you had some very interesting, I think you called them cellmates, right? Kids that
circle groups. I had multiple circle groups that, a circle group in the system is kind of a group of individuals, either quadrantly or regionally, that you're going to be connected to in the system. And within your circle groups, you're bound to the code of silence, meaning you can't talk about what happens within those circle groups. You're also bound to the code of brotherhood, which says two things. You have to love your brother as yourself. It's your duty. And if your brother is caught in sin, it's your job to all extent of the means to cover your brother's sin. So, in these circle groups, you get very close with some of the people that, especially for the hierarchy children, when you're raised up, going through a lot of traumatic situations together, you're used to one another, and you're very close. And I guess, like, if I could describe the relationship of the hierarchy kids in the system in the different circle groups, it's almost like a twin relationship. You're very close, you're loyal, but at the same time, it's like your siblings. You're not usually it's a love-hate relationship. You absolutely will do anything for these people, but at the same time, as to really trusting, that at the end of the day, each person is really just looking out for their own back and their own survival. So it makes it a very difficult situation, because you're bound together to get through things. At the same time, you're kind of playing the game because you have to live.
Exactly. That, I think, sorry to chime in here, but I think that to me has got to be one of the most tragic one of the most tragic things they do to children, because when you look at a child in their natural way of being, their natural habitat. I mean, you go and see children on the beach. Within half an hour, the children have all migrated to each other and they're playing together. Yes, they're going to give each other maybe sand in the eye now and again, right? You know, and compete a little bit now and again. But their natural way is to make friends with each other, right?
Right.
In the system, sadly, it's your they teach you to naturally not trust each other. So you have to have each other's backs. But at the same time, you do not trust each other, because you know at any point in time, your head could literally be next on the block, right? And and of course, at the end of the day, it's a natural human instinct to fight for their own survival. It's natural that you're going to fight for your own survival.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. You know, that's exactly what happens.
Because it's they appeal to your primal instinct, don't they?
They do, and that's how they, you know, that's how they get compliance within the system. You know, that you can't get through it on your own, so you have to work with this person, but at the same time, you know, it puts you in a position where the only life that matters in that moment, in that situation, is the, you know, peers who are going through that with you. You know, because you have to ensure there's almost like an unspoken expectation that in order to live, you have to ensure that they also live, and therefore no one else matters. So that's kind of the double bind that you find yourself in, is that, you know, you don't know what to expect next, but you know you most likely can't get through it alone. So you have to, in order to live, you have to ensure that they survive through it with you.
And they're the only ones that you can really trust to have your back, right? Because it's been so ingrained that you take care of the 4 or 6 of you, however many your circle group is. So those are the ones you take care of. But even I would imagine within that circle group, I would imagine there's lots of fight, flight, or freeze going on in there, right?
And you get micro groups even within your circle groups, the larger ones. So really, you know, you're bonded with, like you said, probably, you know, about 6 or 7 altogether out of various circle groups. You know, but your heart will be bonded to usually 2 or 3. You know, you've got your closest that you have, and then everybody spreads out from there.
When you say your heart will be bonded to 2 or 3, I'm interested to know, excuse me, is that a natural bonding that occurs, or is it done artificially by them? Like they will often do these marriages or binding ceremonies to the kids. Right. So is that some type of a binding ceremony, or is
I think it's you know, this is more natural, and they watch for who you naturally bond with, and that usually then is who they're going to, you know, do the bonding ceremonies with. Unless, you know, there's a forced situation, then they may try to bond you with somebody who you don't want to be bonded with. But you know, it's a both and. They're going to watch to see who you naturally bond with, and, you know, if they can get compliance out of that relationship, they'll allow it as long as both are compliant. And they'll use those relationships to in a way force the compliance. You know, where you get, you know, the peer pressure, you know, we have to do this, or you have to let me do this. And all of that's going to be based off the equilibrium in the system, you know. And so it's important to understand that within the bigger groups, the macro look at the peer groups, you also have the micro. That micro usually is always going to be based off of two because they have to keep the equilibrium. So, one of those children is going to be considered good, the other evil. One's going to be considered the male, the other considered the female. Now, that doesn't mean that genetically they have to be male or female. That has to do more with whether they're stronger in giving energy or receiving energy.
Mm.
That's what it comes down to when they're looking at the male and female. And then they're going to have one that's considered, fire magic, one that's considered water, or they will at times, pair usually one that's earth magic and one that's air magic. Those are kind of the pairings that you'll tend to see within these relationships.
How, how old are the kids when the pairings occur? I would imagine they would watch them for a while. And
Yeah, usually very young. Most of my pairings occurred when I was about 4.5, 5, but that
right.
didn't mean that everybody we were paired to, um, was that age. So let's start. Remind me, and let's try to remember to bring in the pairings as I talk about each one, because we'll kind of look at those dynamics. So the first individual they connected me to, again, I would say it was natural. I don't think that they were um, trying to direct me towards that individual. At the time, we were staying in the suburbs of Chicago. Um, so, you know, there were different schools that I would go to. At the same time, there was still, our family we were going back and forth between the Casper, Wyoming area and the Chicago area. So at both places, I was having things happen that, my parents were not aware of. So there was testing at both sites in the Wyoming area as well as the Chicago area. And the Wyoming area, it's important to understand that that is a massive sovereign military order training hub. The Chicago Training Center is connected to the Chicago Underground Military Base. When you look back at the Chicago Fair and all the things that have happened there, the fires, all of that connects with massive, that center and facility and military base are built to handle mass amounts of energy, including nuclear energy. So that's one of the largest training centers for that. So, my I in the Chicago area, we were in the suburb, and there were other, little boys that were in my kind of vicinity. We all lived within a couple blocks of each other, and the boy that I ended up getting paired with, who I call my training partner, his house was just literally like across the street and about a block, not even quite a block, but it was like a block down the road. Like I could walk out from our porch and could just, turn my head to the right and could see the big 2-story yellow house. And so in that, you know, initially, um, he would like that was what we called his grandfather's house. And, I didn't know that this character is anything else other than his grandfather initially. And that was the Nazi Michael Karkock. So the Nazi Michael Karkock was staying at the big 2-story yellow house. And we called him Did Me Hall. And the first time, I remember the first time when I was like, well, what's your grandfather's name? He said, oh, we call him Did Me Hall. And I started laughing because I was like, Did? His first name is Did. Like I was just a little, 4.5-year-old, and I could not comprehend Like why anybody would have the name Did, you know? I didn't know it was Ukrainian for grandfather Michael, right? But we called him Did Mihal. And so anyway, though, the first time we met was actually in a school classroom, and there were a couple other boys that were from the Chicago neighborhood. Um, one of them, you know, all of them were about age 5. So one of them was a blondie, big blue eyes. We'll call him Eric. The other one was named Christopher. He had dark brown hair, and they were always playing cowboy and Indian. Yet they would make me like the Indian, and you know they would then take all their little toy guns and shoot at me and all this stuff, and we're kind of mean. Then we had, you know, right next door, we had a family that had 2 boys and a daughter who was my age. The oldest son in that, he was about, I think he was about 10 or 11 when we first connected. Um, and then the younger one was a year older than me and his sister. And you know, they're like she was probably the only female friend I ever had in my younger years. She was just this cute, I got to describe her. We'll call her Margaret. She had the cutest little heart-shaped face. You know, I mean, I was like sprawly. I grew up with all boy cousins. I was really a Tom girl, but she was like the epitome of the girly girl. She had all this golden, curly ringlet hair. And whenever I went over there, she always wanted to play shopping. She had all this sets for, you know, little grocery cart and the little register and money and um, all the little grocery things. And, you know, her brothers would always be like coming in and irritating us. And they were being trained in sovereign. The oldest one was being trained sovereign military. The youngest one was being trained more in what we call the brotherhood side. So they had 2 different training programs. She was connected to Beta Kitty. Now, here's the scandalous thing. So their parents were part of the production of the child pornography in that area. So, like, there was only certain times that I was allowed over there because I was set apart. Like, I wasn't part of, you know, that kind of stuff, even though there was times I had to witness it. So usually there was only certain times that they would allow me over to the household, and they would try to hide all of that. But it was the oldest boy who was dealing with a lot of anger from being in the pornography. And he and I and my training partner would get into outright fights. And, you know, in fact, like one time he was so mean, and I got mad that he stole the money from the cash register for the store from poor little Margaret. And I went after him and started pummeling him. And we fell down on the ground, and we're sitting there rolling around on the ground fighting one another for that cash money. And he got in the biggest trouble for that. He ended up getting horrifically tortured because he had they considered it, he had touched me even though there wasn't anything other than, you know, childhood stuff that had gone on. And I stood up for him and said, you know, no, he didn't do anything wrong in that. Like, I'm the one who pummeled him. But he still got tortured for that. And after that, he went into this mode of complete silence, and just whenever he would see me or my training partner, he would give me these like just angry, scorning looks. He was so mad. Um, so those were some of the neighborhood dynamics. Well, so then, get back to the classroom. The first day in class at kindergarten, I was super excited. I had got to buy new shoes. They were little shoes with little ETs on them, like little white tennis shoes with laces. Even though I could not, for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to tie laces. Um, the teacher in that class, like when we got there, she was trying to show me, like I had never really even got to put the shoes on besides just trying them on. So she's like, "Oh, I'm going to teach you how to tie the shoes." And she kept doing that little bunny thing with the ears, put the little bunny ears and then loop over loop. And my little mind was like, this makes no sense, lady. Like, what in the world are you thinking? But she's like, well, fine, we'll go over it again later. Just put your shoes in this little cubby hole until we need them. So I put my shoes in the little cubby hole. Well, I never got to wear them. Like, the story was that they got stolen. And my pair of shoes that I wanted so badly, I never got to even wear. And I ended up with this pair of shoes that I absolutely hated. They were horrible and they were just no good for the things that I was exposed to in the system. And I would get mad. And finally, I ended up chucking the shoes and burying them in the ground. Um, at that age, my secret skill that I had learned while fishing with my father was that I would get my bare feet on the dirt and stuff, and I would kind of knead the dirt, like like push it and knead it, and I would like make these holes with my heels in in the dirt, and then I buried those suckers, and I would do that often with my ritual clothes as well, like when they wanted me to wear dresses or other things. The poor woman who had to dress me in the system for all of these events would have to dig through these holes to to bring out my ritual clothes. So
Wow.
in this meeting, they had all of us in a circle group. There was about 20 kids. I didn't know all of them. I knew, some of the boys. And I ended up, like, I think I was sitting first. And then my training partner, the one who ended up being my training partner, came and he sat next to me. And so as we're all sitting there in a circle, the mothers come out, and it was just three of them. So we had, my proctor and then two of the other mothers who were kind of the ones out of the five that would be assigned to tend to all of the children that were successors and kind of your higher level in the system. So they pulled out this box and they pulled out items in there and started arranging the items in a circle in the middle. Um, and there were things like, a tarot card, a shawl, black candle, um, just items that went with different forms of witchcraft. So like there was like a raven's feather. Um, I just remember there was a lot of different items that later, at first we didn't even know what the items were. Um, so one of the items was a little gold mirror, and then I was seeing like kind of just sitting there like this blue sword. And it was like, huh. And then, she's so funny, the one mother, she was, we're talking Mothers of Darkness. She's like, we're all gonna play a game. And she was really trying to excite it up and make it sound like it was something so exciting. And she's like, all right, one at a time, you're going to get called and you're going to stand up and you're going to go pick your item out of the circle. And I want you to stand there and show everybody what you picked and then put it back down and go sit back down. When I heard that, it was me. I was like, ha, like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, this is a game. This doesn't sound fun. And, that was my reaction, but I was saying it all in my head and I was like, ha, like, what is this? Right. And all of a sudden, I hear, but he's not doing it out loud. The little boy sitting next to me, he's snickering and laughing too. And I turned and I looked at him and I was like, "Can you hear me?" And I'm saying this in my head. And he was like, "Of course." And I was like, "This is a stupid game." And he's like, "I don't know why we would play this." And he's like, so we started talking in our heads together. We didn't know any better, we didn't know any different, but we started this communication thing. And
Wow.
so, he had gotten up, he picked the mirror, and when I got up, I picked the sword. Now, what I didn't know was that others could not see that. There was only a few people, my training partner being one of them, who saw it. And then the mother saw it, and my proctor, when I stood there holding it up, she's like, "Jessie, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm showing the item." And she said, "And what do you have?" And I said, "A sword." And now, you know, what it was that it was not one of the items that they had put there. The Lord had
Oh,
put it
wow.
there. And that sword was assigned to them that I could see and hear in the spirit, beyond what they were doing. So anyway, after that, um, you know, eh, the mothers had a room like within the Cathedral of St. Peter, there in Rockford, Illinois, which was, the church was the upper parts of the training center, but the bulk of the training center is below ground. And then you have tunnels that from there that connect underneath the graveyard into different parts in the Rockford, Chicago area. Um, you have, the connecting to the military base, but then you also have the outskirts of the Rockford area where they had a lot of the sovereign military stationed. There was another school out there that was a private school. Um, close to there, they had a massive reservation, a natural area that had a pond, and the highway, the big road, sits on one side of the natural reservation, and then on the other side you had more land. And that's where they had one of two barns that they would use for rituals, out in that area. And it's heavily guarded by sovereign military. So, coming into this, then, you know, within the training center, there was long hallways. At the end of that hallway, we had one of our, uh, I guess we'll say, our defense magic rooms, where we would, like we were very scheduled as children. So usually the first few hours of every day was doing defense training with Michael Carcock. Where basically he beat the hell out of us and was teaching us defense in magic. Um, but
How many kids were being taught by him at this point in time? I
just
mean,
us
when you
two, yeah, just me and my training partner.
okay, what about the
The
rest of your
only ones
siblings?
prior to that, the ones prior to that were ended up being the two major players through the U.S. military and Central Intelligence, and that was Colonel Michael Aquino, who headed up the Department of Defense, and then John O'Brien, who headed up the intelligence agency. So those were the two before us that he trained and helped to put into those positions to operate the spiritual gates and the different training programs that would operate or operate around the spiritual gates. So that
Right.
that was Karkak's specialty, was defense magic. And when we're talking about the reasons for defense magic, magic is all about energy and the movement of energy. So in the defense of it, it's about the control and being able to control different amounts of energy. Michael Carcock's specialty was mass energy, including nuclear energy. So that's really what he was training was, those who could basically, control mass amounts of energy if they were unleashed or harnessed.
Wow.
Yeah.
So looking for the real, I mean, I don't know if the word for that would be super soldier kids. I don't know. I think that
No,
word
it's
is going
beyond
to be,
that because it's
yeah,
really gets into national security. You have your
yeah,
super soldiers are assigned to specific events. The job of, part of our job in the system was to understand, um, you know, understand the energy and that would be harnessed, whether through the spiritual gates or from country to country. And, as the heads of the Luciferian Brotherhood and the Sovereign Military Order, which that's what, that's kind of where our positions went as the Queen Mother of Darkness. I was considered the head over the Brotherhood, and as the head protector, my training partner was seen as the head over the entire sovereign military. So, our jobs went national, and therefore, our skills and our training had to be, um, able to deal with any form of weaponry that would come against the system, which included nuclear weaponry. Um,
wow,
so that's,
wow,
the bulk of our training. But so at the end of that hallway was the massive training room where, we were learning from Karkak initially. But right next to it, like if you were facing that room to the right, there was down that hallway about 3, 4 doors, and the one that was closest to the defense training room was a closet, and that's where the Mothers of Darkness kept that box with all those goodies. So my training partner was somebody that was very mischievous, and he was highly skilled in so many things, and his head would get puffed up in all of his stellar skills and abilities because he was kind of a scrawny little, scrawny boy, uh, kind of lanky, um, not super tall, but just lanky. And, he had learned how to pick locks, and he was super excited that he could pick that lock for that closet. And he wanted to get in there and get his item because he was mad that, he picked his item and then he had to put it back. And then they put it in the box, and they took the box from there and put it in the closet. And he was like, "Why don't I get my item?" And so, the one day, in between training sessions, we would be allowed to go outside, but all that was really outside, was you'd walk a bit away from the church, and either you could go across the street to the school or you would go a little ways down to the graveyard. And that was probably the biggest place at that time where it felt like we could kind of be out and about and have freedom. Those were the only two approved spots where we could be. So usually we were in the graveyard and, just sitting around talking smack with each other. But he had got the idea, I want to get in that closet and we're going to check out and see, if we can find that item. And so we got in there, and he stole that mirror. And then, we stood in the hallway, and I could never explain how this happened, but I believe it was the protection of God hiding us. But the mothers sensed, one particular mother, um, who she was considered, she wasn't the one that they would put with the children because she was just evil. She was the one I've talked about in stories that would put the drops of poison in the family pies, not enough to kill anybody, but whoever ate that pie would have diarrhea and other things and would be sick after the family
I mean,
events.
what kind of person does that? I mean,
This one
what,
did that. But
she was fun? Was it for fun she was doing this to see how people would
She
react? Or
just enjoyed evil. She really did. She was into dark black magic. So she sensed that something was not right, and they went, we were like plumb against the wall when they walked past us, and they got to that closet and realized that mirror was missing. And we stood there. They kept going back and forth several times trying to figure out where it had gone, why, where was it? And he had put it in his pocket. And like I said, he was a skinny, lanky kid, but forever he kept that mirror, or, later it was just the glass from the mirror. He kept that in his pocket and they never saw it. And I could never figure out, it purely was an act of God hiding that, but he'd keep that little mirror in his pocket, and they never caught us. But he was kind of the brains. He would come up with these ideas for payback for the things that we were experiencing, because that really was the only way that, it was one of our coping mechanisms. Because some of the kids in the system, as you get down the chain, some of them are, given more, I guess what we would call, maybe not, not that they wanted it or anything, but some of the children were given different forms of coping mechanisms, whether that was erasing memories or they'd be drugged. Um, not just you'd have different types of drugs that would be given. Sometimes they would do a light sedative that um, would kind of make it so you were groggy and traveling, so you couldn't remember the way you had come or where you were going. Um, for that, like, sometimes with the drugging, you'd be blindfolded because they wouldn't want you to know where you were at. And he, my training partner, had got the idea, like he was like really brilliant. Like, a lot of the information that I share are things that he figured out mathematically, or, in whatever way. But he used to sit there and he would tell me, like, we'd get in a car and um, to be taken someplace, and he'd be like, "Can you feel the tire rotations?" And I was like, "Yes." And he would be like, "Count them." And I would count them. And from that, he would figure out the distance from one place to where we were. And then from there, he would try to piece out where had we been taken. And he did the same thing with the tunnel systems. He would tell me, to put one foot directly in front of the other as we were walking through the tunnels. And he would say, count your steps. And from there, he figured out that the majority of the tunnel systems were based off of a 7-mile radius, and that the above grounds were maps for what was underground. So from there, we began to figure out, where we were at, so we could, kind of know those things. But a lot of the kids would be drugged, being taken from one place to another. Then they would have drugs that would be used to erase the memories. Frankincense was one that would be used a lot by the mothers. Um, they were notorious for having frankincense lozenges. And I can't scientifically explain how they could suck on the lozenge and keep their memories, but when they would breathe on people with that lozenge, it would erase people's memories. Maybe there was more to it than just the frankincense lozenger, but those would be things that I would experience as a kid, where it's like, okay,
what would
they
what
breathe
would
on the
that
person and they lose their memories. What's
what
up with
would
that?
that be though? I mean, from your experience, what would that be that they're breathing over the poor child
I'm
and
not
your
sure,
memory is
I mean,
gone?
they would have different, forms of unclassified drugs that they would use, whether they were injecting or having somebody to drink it or putting it in food. They would do a lot of different things. But They would also put stuff into their rings. The mother's rings would have, little needles on them where then they would, um, they could inject different things into people or onto their hair, and then it would go in their head. And, so there were different drugs that they would use for stuff. Um, but, we weren't allowed to usually have the drug things. So, um, like our coping mechanism then, usually revolved around being mischievous and coming up with playful ideas to pay back. So that was something that we spread in the different circle groups as we, began to be to work with other kids in different projects and programs and experiments. Um, we kind of would, we were the rebel rousers. We would be like, hey, we've got an idea. And usually the idea was my training partners, but I would be the one who could get all the other kids on board with the ideas. So I was kind of the mass recruiter to make the ideas come forth, even though I wouldn't know what the whole plan was. He wouldn't tell me the whole plan. He would just be like, "Oh, let's, get them all here, or we need this or that," and I'd get the supplies and I'd get everybody where they needed to be. Um, without it being noticeable that we were plotting or planning something. I was very, very good at that because I had grown up with my boy cousins and, I was kind of the ringleader among them as well. So in that, we then had some of the other boys that came onto the scene. We have E, who we've talked about. Um, I've brought forward now that E was Elon, and he was older than us. There were some specific events I've shared, where he was with us. So somewhere in the Midwest, um, when we were witnessing the auctioning of children through the Frank Lloyd Wright houses, um, one of the initial things that we went through together ended up being connected to the buying and the selling and the trading off of the hierarchy children's energy in the system. So one of the first connecting things that they had the three of us do before we started projects together was that they had us, you know, they had a big piece of paper. I don't know how else to describe it. And they had all these children together into, groups of three, and we all had to put like our handprints on paper. Now, we had already gone through the ritual where we had to put our handprints in blood on a wall under the training centers that we went to. So this was on top of that currency. So the three of us put our handprints on it, made a picture with it. And I can remember, sitting there, and I was one that could pick up on feelings and was really good at reading how people were feeling. And E, in my experience of him, was very, very inwardly drawn, very depressed. There was a heavy oppression that he carried. And I just like was sitting there on the ground, you know, with all this paint that we're putting up, and I looked at him and I just went, just smiled really big at him. And then I chucked some paint at him, and he just broke out in a laugh. And that was kind of our first connection, was that it was like, let's have some fun. And so then, it was like, we're going to get all the other, and then, my next thought beyond let's have fun was let's get the other kids to do it too. Right. So then we started making this big mess that, the people who were trying to do the ritual that we didn't know we were in with our handprints, were really mad about all that they had to clean up. Um, and I remember one of the ladies, this is so funny. They, when we first got there, they would make us put on these smocks. Like they were old shirts, like usually like dress shirts that men would wear, but not like with the long sleeves. They were the short sleeve men dress shirts back in the 80s. And they had like all these little um what do you like poles on the wall, like little pegs on the wall. And that, each peg had its nice little shirt hanging from it. And, this woman, oh, you're going to all go pick a shirt, pick your shirt. I can't do the whatever it was accent she was doing. It was a mix between German, Polish, maybe it was Ukrainian, I don't know, but pick your shirt, this heavy set little woman. And, then you go sit down on the floor, don't make a mess. Because they're all clean freaks. She was one of the virtue squad. Her job was to keep us in compliance for the task. And when I tell you, you will put your hand in the paint and press it, very nicely. You all know how to press. You've done it on the wall, you know. Palms. I mean, literally, she's like, you start with your palm and you press it down clean and firm. I expect it to be crisp, sharp looking.
Chris.
Yes. Yes, ma'am, but and we're all just, it's like you're sitting there and it's like, yeah, let's have, this woman needs some fun. That was my conclusion. This woman needs some fun. I can make that happen. I I've got lots of ideas in my head how to make that happen. And my training partner was he was a very quiet person too. He would just sit there. He would make one or two comments. He'd talk to me privately, in our heads. But he would just kind of snicker, because he knew my little mind was going. And then, so we got everybody to make a mess, and they, that woman was not happy. But then from there, they sold it. And so we had one of the first big auctioning events at one of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses. And they, made it look like it was a school event and that they were selling the little kids' school artwork. And, the individual that purchased our handprints was Jacob Rothschild. And he also purchased, because beyond that, they also would make us make little things like with Lincoln Logs or Tinker Toys. E was the master of Tinker Toys, like the things that he could make with those Tinker Toys was phenomenal. And I remember for a long time, Jacob Rothschild, in his main office in his mansion, he had a desk behind it, he had a bookshelf, and kind of in the back left corner of that, he had that Tinker Toy thing that E had made. And, so he would display, like, why he had a lot of that stuff was because he was one of the main contract holders for the Golden Dawn. Part of his job was to actually hold some of the contracts that weren't on the walls, or that they would pull off for currencies. So that was part of what he did. So
when you talk about the handprints and Jacob Rothschild purchased your handprints, okay, now we've spoken quite a bit in the past as well about, like, literally when the kids are born and, the soul prints and the handprints, because that really is pretty much them laying claim to you, right?
Right. So they'll buy, sell, they will bid, and it's a continuous market. So they continue to bid and buy, purchase, and so whoever, because he had those contracts, it gave him like extra, I mean, it's not really power per se. It's like a pass, or a
Right.
vote. It gave him a vote in saying, you know, because I have the fingerprints or one of the fingerprints contracts, therefore I get a vote on, the works of their hands, which, their job is to prevent you really from doing the works that God's prepared in advance for you to do.
Wow. So
So
that's really part of that ritual, right? Is that actually? I mean, it's your hands now become his hands.
in a
You've
way, yeah, but it's like a vote because he's not going to be the only or the sole holder of it, because you also have, whatever walls where the handprints were, those are the main contracts that are made to Baal and Molech. So those are the big principalities that are going to have authority in that. And then you've got, like, one of the walls I named was under Rockford, Illinois. So, that training center and whoever's running that training center has a vote. So it becomes different players in the votes over what decisions or what avenues within the system. They're going to look at, what are you good at? What are your specialty skills? How can the system use you? Are you appropriate to the position that they've picked you for? Um, what is Lucifer's plan for you? And how is that going to unfold through different avenues? So not only is there a vote, but then there's like an obligation. So, besides holding a vote or a contract, it kind of gives them access like a godparent. They now are obliged to be behind the creation of opportunities for the avenues in which you're supposed to go. So, let's say, like, for military training, there's 4 main military bases that children are going to be trained at. Each of those bases are going to, the players at those bases are going to bid to train certain children. They want to know, what are the proposed specs they're getting in that child.
wow.
What do they think they can do with the child? And as they train, your specs get higher based on what can you magically do in the system. And now you become, a major player where it's not necessarily a handler or ownership type thing in those situations. It's more of alliances, because if your power and your abilities bypass those who are the holders of your contracts, they want to be in good standing with you, because otherwise, they could be dead meat. So it's kind of it becomes almost like a godparent position where they have an obligation, if they're feeling you're going to be better somewhere else, then they have to make those arrangements for you. They have to get those doors open, and they become kind of your allies in the opportunities that are going to be afforded you in your training or the programs. So that's really the position that he was in, would be, someone as a holder of the contract having a say in what happened to us, where we went, what projects, programs, or experiments we were in. But in that, then also, in the long run, having a say as to, who could we make alliances with? Who was able to bid um, on our contracts? Who was able to profit or to use our abilities um, in the different ways that were being proposed? Behind that, the biggest individual who had a say for us, because of the specialty-ness of our training and our experiences, was the Nazi Karkok.
Right.
Because, we were trained in the defense, understanding the spiritual gates and the fullness of the operation of the spiritual gates. So
I'm interested. Sorry, I'm just interested to know when you say that Jacob Rothschild pretty much bought your handprints, right, as a kid. What did he see? What was the reason that he actually bought yours, and who else's in your circle group did he buy? Do you know? And I'm interested to know what his intention was with that.
Yeah, I think it was just it's a place of power and authority.
Yeah.
You know, and in that, he had an obligation that, you know, as being higher level members in the system, you know, you're going to have authority and say. So, in a way, his holding our contract, it was a hold in trust until we stepped into our positions. And then those contracts and others, you know, we then would be able to manage or have. Like for me, my position came with the full authority of everybody in the system. So my contract was held in trust until I could step into and take that authority. The same with my
What
training
age
group.
would that have been? Was that 10 that you would have taken that
Age
authority?
10, age 10 is when we were fully trained to be able to step
Right,
into those positions. But
right.
you know, our call up was not at that moment. So it wasn't until later. But now my training partner was different though. He stepped into his position at age 7, about age 6.5, 7. So that's when he took his position as the head of the protectors.
Right. Wow. Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I know we pretty much running out of time, but maybe when you are you able to just explain in closing to our guests what it meant to be head of the protectors and what the protectors are? Because that's quite a phenomenal achievement for a 7-year-old boy.
Yeah. So in my series on my website, kingdomlivingwithjessie.com, I have a series called The Unveiling of the System. And in there, I've been breaking down piece by piece the structure of the system. So, you know, it's pretty much split into two parts where you have the governmental side, which is the Luciferian Brotherhood, and then you have their military, which is called the Sovereign Military Order. At the very top of that sovereign military, you have those who are known as the protectors. There's 6 main departments. The sixth one being, you know, that's overseen. The whole thing's overseen by the head protector, but so he has direct oversight over the whole thing, but also has his own department within that. And then underneath them, the protectors, you know, they're going to oversee the quadrant leaders in the sovereign military called the supreme preceptors. So that's who they'll give their orders directly to. And then that will be both, you know, within the United States as well as internationally. And then those quadrant leaders will oversee the regional sovereign military leaders who are known as preceptors, excuse me. And then those preceptors are going to oversee different Knights Templar groups. So the
Right.
bulk of the army is made up of Knights Templars. So the regional leader's job is to oversee those knights, to give them orders to accomplish different missions or tasks. All of those coming through their head protectors. Each of those head protectors are going to be under the jurisdiction of a mother of darkness. So, you know, as a child, I have some of this in my affidavit. The person who was, like, you had Michael Karkock kind of sitting over the entire sovereign military. But the person that they had at the time as the head protector was an individual out of the Rockford, Illinois area. And, each of those head protectors are going to have two individuals that they're in charge of training, who will then succeed in their position. So those positions are earned by succession, and they do fight amongst each other to see who will get the position. So usually each head protector will have a junior protector under them. That's going to be somebody, in their teens to early young adulthood. And then they'll be training a child protector. And so they'll gather and they'll have these big, massive battles with one another. And whoever wins that battle, usually the head protectors in those battles will be called the Black Dragons. And you'll have whoever, wins at the final rounds becomes, the top Black Dragon. So, at that young age, they didn't expect him to win, but my training partner beat out, so that meant, their first rounds, all the children who are being trained in those successions will fight each other. Then they will, if they pass and win, then they're going to fight all the junior protectors, and you've got at the same time all the junior protectors fighting one another for top positions, and then they'll have the child winners and the junior protectors fighting each other, and then you'll also have all the adults fighting one another for top positions, and then they'll fight whatever junior children protectors who win. And so he had to fight all those individuals in order to take that top spot. Now, ironically, I believe there's one other individual that many of us know, and he'd have to confirm this, but I believe that he definitely was there as a child protector in training. And we know that individual who he is, but that other child who fought in some of those battles and was considered a second contender, he was considered a backup contender in taking the second place, and that was Adrian John Wells. Yeah.
Wow.
So he'd have to confirm that, but I would propose that's how I remember things happening.
Wow. Yeah, and Adrian John Wells has been on this show as well. And
Yeah.
man, oh man, have they stalked that poor man, really. He's relentlessly hunted, literally hunted by them. Wow, Jessie, another fabulous show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's so interesting, and we've also spoken a lot in the past, and we will still in the future, because I think what's important for me to get across is that all of these evil people in the world, all at one time, were innocent children who had their innocence robbed from them.
Mm-hmm.
And, at some point, let's hope, I don't know, they can find it again, that's always our greatest prayer. I don't believe that we are all dark. And we're seeing a lot of the world leaders today have come out of these, in the top positions, have been taken into the system literally since birth. So it's a very well-oiled machine we're dealing with here, the cabal. And they know exactly what they're doing. They've been doing it for many, many, many centuries. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll get into, next time we'll start to get into some of the other circle groups as we got into our training in the military programs. And then some of our ritual circle groups, which included some of the Rothschild boys. But we'll start to get into some of the other characters and players and some of the other stuff that we endured.
I look forward. Everybody. Jess, would you maybe just like to, well, again, you can just tell people where they can get hold of you, although all your details will be below, but maybe, again, you can just tell people where they can get hold of you. And unless you have something to wrap up with, you can end off for us in prayer.
Okay. Yeah, so you can find me on the kingdomlivingwithjessie.com. And again, I encourage you, check out, utilize the things that I have on there. You can get a hold of my courses, my workshops, my books, and my different coaching series where I teach about the system and, how do we overcome those things that the system has tried to bind us as a society under. So with that, let's end in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this time together. We thank you for this conversation. Lord, we just remember now all the children who have gone through the system. Lord, we ask that you would bless them. We ask that you would bring healing to each one. We ask, Lord God, that you would allow their stories to come forward. And in that, Father, we ask that you would put an end to the evil of the system and the sovereign military. And we ask for freedom from that. We thank you for the testimonies of all who have come forward. And we ask for your continued blessings every day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jessie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for yet another amazing show. Please share this show. I think we like, share, subscribe. You're agnostic as well. But really good to just get this information out there and just reach as many as people as what we can with these horrible truths. Truth is not always pleasant. It's something we need to know nonetheless. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody. God bless you all. And I look forward to seeing you very, very soon again. See you very soon.